we're a general hire company, and as such, a lot of our jobs don't actually require a lift plan. When you talk about lift planning, everyone gets on the bandwagon about having all this paperwork and everything in place, but in reality, majority of general crane hirers, such as ourselves and a lot of smaller, organisations around the place, go to jobs every day where there is no plan. So I know for us, we take phone calls. We cover, probably 100, 150k radius from Shepparton in country Victoria. So, if we were to go and have a look at every job before we went and did it, it would add considerable cost to the job, and or we may not win the work at all. So our schedulers, they take as much information as they can over the phone about the job. Where we can, we use near maps and these types of tools, or get the customer to send us some photos and things like that to try and establish what we're up against before we get there. But a lot of times, we don't go to site with a formalised plan. So the guys have a bit of an idea, but they get there, and we rely on their expertise and their training to be able to assess the job and formulate a bit of a plan on site. We already do the plan. We don't just go to site, set up the crane, and then go, well, what are we going to lift? We usually ask the questions, what are we lifting, where it's got to go, and try and work out the plan from there. So why document a lift plan? I mean, the main reason I started doing documented lift plans was to satisfy my clients and their requirements. But some of the other reasons are, obviously to demonstrate that we have adequate capacity to do the lift or the job. To show site personnel, the people on site, what's going to happen, and any requirements that that may affect them. For instance, you might need traffic management, or we might need to have an exclusion zone. We do it to help identify issues that may arise, during the process of doing a lift, and to share the plan with the crew that's going to site. So what to consider when doing a lift plan? I just did a bit of a list here, which you need to obviously consider the load itself, its weight, its dimensions, its centre of gravity, whether it's top heavy or not. Also, the load, its lifting points. So some loads have designated lifting points, some may not. You might have to work out how you're going to sling that load. It may well not have, points, like, for instance, a modular building. Often they don't have lifting points. You just got to sling around underneath them with slings or whatever. We have to, if it does have lifting points, we have to ensure that they're safe, of adequate capacity for the lifts to be done. Like sometimes lifters are put on things and the, for instance, cooling towers, often there's lifters on a top half and on a bottom half, and they get lifted together, but you can't actually lift the whole cooling tower off one of those sets of lifters because they're not designed to do that. So, they're all things that got to be considered, and also damaging the load. We want to lift the load off safely and everything like that, but also we can't afford to damage or squash the load or this type of thing. So they're all things that you need to take into account. Load factors, obviously, if you're doing a multi-crane lift or a demolition lift, there's additional factors to be put in place. So we need to consider that when we're working out which crane and whatever we're going to use. And also sometimes clients impose their own factors. For instance, some companies don't want you to go above 85% of the load chart. So, you've got to take that into account. The rigging, we have to consider what type of rigging would be suitable to lift the load, in capacity, and the configuration of how we put all that together. We also would need to, once again, work out, remember that the hook block and all of your rigging is considered to be part of the weight of the load when assessing the crane's chart. Assess the slinging of the load. Something that's often overlooked is, how we sling the load. We've got to get up there. We might need access equipment to access it, or scaffolding, or some sort of safe way of getting up there to hook it up if it requires to be done from heights. And also at the other end of the lift, when we've done the lift off and it's forgotten how we're going to unhook the load. So crane type, capacity, configuration, and deductions, etc. So, what type of crane we're going to use to do the job, its capacity and what configuration, what boom length, and what, how much counterweight, if that's, a crane that takes its own additional counterweight, how much counterweight we need to put on the crane to do the job safely. And then also any deductions. For instance, some cranes, if they've got a fly jib mounted on the side that's not being used, sometimes there's a deduction you have to take off the chart to allow for that fly that's hanging on the boom. Not always, but some cranes. What else we got? Next one down. We move on to the outrigger positions. We've got to get the outriggers in a position. Also, counterweight swing, as I just discussed. The counterweight could hit the building, or it might hit, if you're doing panels, it might hit the panel props or whatever once you swing around. Or sometimes you lift the load into position, and actually it's quite close to where the crane where you land the load, and when you swing around, the counterweight might hit the load when you're packing up. So these are the type of things. Boom clearance. Sometimes if you're lifting over a high wall or whatever, the boom might strike the edge of the building. So they're all things that have to be taken into account. Ground capacity. What's the ground like? Is it solid? Do we need a geotech report? Generally, this is where crane operator experience comes in, because some sites you go to, they require a geotech report to be done, and they'll pay for that. But majority of sites that we go to, no geotech reports done, because it's a cost to someone, and often it's not required if it's suspect ground where we feel it might be a bit soft. Generally, we just go with using bigger pad underneath the outriggers to reduce the ground pressure. But there are cases where some clients, they want a geotech report done on every lift, so that's sort of on them to organise. But anyway, something you have to take into account. Other considerations are around permits. For instance, certain cranes, or majority of cranes, have a network of roads they're allowed to travel on, and some they're not allowed to travel on. And generally, the bigger the crane, the harder it is to get it to site. You have to apply for permits through NHVR for local council roads, and also the state regulatory roads. Also, consideration is, if you're lifting a load from a truck, can you get the truck in close enough to the crane to get the load off? Sometimes when you're lifting a long switch room or something like that, you might be able to place it quite easily beside you, but you might have to reach out end on to pick it up off the back of the truck. So, getting the truck in close enough to the crane, getting your counterweights onto the crane if it's one that needs counterweight. So, any all-terrain cranes, particularly the bigger ones where there's a lot of counterweight to go on, or fly or whatever, you still need to be able to get the trucks close enough to the crane to get that counterweight on. So, and other equipment, for access or whatever might need to be working beside you. Sometimes you do a lift on a communication tower. You might be on top of a hill. There's not much room up there, and we've got to set the crane up, and we've also got to have a travel tower on there somewhere. So these are all things that need to be taken into account, not just the crane itself. Nearby hazards, obviously we've got to look out for power lines, trenches, excavations, traffic, pedestrians, all of these types of things, which generally you'll tick off in your safe work method statement, but they're all considerations for where the crane might be set up as well. Obviously power lines, you've got to sit back a certain distance depending on the voltage and size of the power lines and whatever. So they will impact where the crane is positioned, and also the lift plan. Like I said before, access to release the rigging. We've got to be able to get up there and unhook if it's at a height where we're lifting the load to. So something to keep in mind. Weather, big objects that might catch a lot of wind, we've got to be mindful of that, or if the rain's going to impact or whatever. So communication, how we're going to communicate, whether that's whistle, radio, hand signals, whatever. The timing of the job, some jobs have to occur at night time. It might be a job on a roadway where they're closing part of the roadway. They won't do it during the day. It has to be done at night. So, sometimes that can be an issue. And, the other thing with a lift plan is that often we complete the lift plan, we get it all done, and then we find that things have changed between, having done the plan and the guys arriving on site. So, that's probably one of the biggest issues we face. We go and look at a job, we do a lift plan, we've got it all planned out, and all of a sudden the guys rock up on site with the crane and someone's dug a trench where the crane's got to go. So hence there needs to be a bit of contingency in there to be able to make adjustments on the go. So anyway, how to represent a lift plan, and I guess depending which angle you're coming from. If you're a crane hirer, what I've just showed you is probably pretty boring stuff. If you're in an office, you might have experienced it before. So and vice versa here. Like we move through of detailed here, we can use a CICA. CICA have developed a simple lift plan on their website, which anyone can access and use, and then a detailed one. Clients, some of them have their own template they want you to use. I know, for instance, CPB, John Holland, we did some work on the Westgate Tunnel project, and they had their own template they wanted us to fill out, which is not a bad thing. That was all right. So we would do that each time. Some people develop their own template, which we have. We've got our own, which is very almost identically close to CPB's template. But anyway, so yeah, you can develop your own plan template. Lift planning software that helps to demonstrate, where the crane's positioned, and also your rigging, how your rigging looks and whatever. So ground pressure charts and spreadsheets, and then in your lift plan you would try and include as much relevant information to demonstrate, for instance, crane charts and whatever that prove that you've got the capacity you're saying you have. Because anyone can just do up a lift plan and put whatever numbers they want in there, really. So, some companies have a process where they evaluate the lift plan, and they have lift engineers that actually go through and check. And I've, experienced that many times where they'll come back to you and say, "Oh, we're not real happy about the capacity of this. We want these things to be a bit thicker or whatever, or a bit bigger." And then what has to happen is then, if you put something heavier on, it changes the actual weight of your rigging, which changes the whole weight of your load. So you've sort of got to revisit the whole calculations on the whole thing, because that actually slightly changes your ground pressures. So it's a bit of a backwards and forwards process working through that. Anyway, challenges with a lift plan. Like I said before, things can change. Another challenge I find is that the crew can become reliant on a plan if they're getting them all the time. Like, probably our guys in our bigger cranes, not that we're that big, 250 is our biggest, but it's a lot bigger than the little Franner that I started with. Some of those guys, and they get a plan given to them all the time, and if they go back to a job and they haven't quite got all the information that they had before on the previous job, they start, getting a bit lazy, I suppose. And in fact, I've had operators come work for me. I had one guy that drove a 350-ton crawler in a mine, and he did drive some levers and whatever, and he come out and come back to us and worked in general hire, and he'd been getting lift plans all the time, which told him where he was setting up, what rigging was going on. He didn't really have to think. He'd jump in the crane and pull the levers, and then when he worked for us and he was going out on jobs, particularly in the smaller cranes where there's no lift plans or whatever, he'd start flipping out because he had to actually use his own brain, and he probably didn't have the experience that he sort of made out that he had. So, I think lift plans sometimes can make people complacent. The other challenges with lift plans are the cost involved in and time in actually developing them. So, like I say, a little 2-hour Franner job, that's not worthwhile going and doing a 2-hour lift plan on the job. You'd make no money. So I know I've sort of rushed through. This is supposed to be only a basic outline, which I hope, most of you may have picked up something out of it.